Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ben's Almanac. I'm Mac, and this is devlog number 3, part of the series where I build tools in public, walk through the process, and share what I'm learning along the way. All right, let's jump into it. So, last week and the general phase before that was more about planning. It was about taking the idea for the presentation builder, the core focus of this devlog series, and making it real on paper. The goal wasn't to start coding yet. It was more about shaping something tight enough that I could keep building on it week to week. And I mean, basically, I call it weaponized laziness, where you just hate inefficiency so much because it causes you to do more work that you really drill in on exactly what the plan is before you start so you don't waste the effort. And I feel like we did a solid job of that last week, and getting that design written out gave me the backbone and structure I needed to start actually implementing with confidence. In contrast, this week is when things actually started coming together in code. I got the repo set up, the folders organized, started translating those design notes into something runnable, did some of the initial coding components for the different modules in the source code. It's early days, but having the first version live made the whole setup feel more stable. And it's like the foundation's finally in place for everything else that's coming along. I will say I didn't get as much done as I was hoping for this last week. A wedding came up, and so I was away for the weekend and traveling on some of those endpoints. But at least from what has been produced so far, the design notes still seem solid, although some choices on exactly how to organize the data and what each slide choice will need has come up and needs to be defined more. So good learning process this last week. And as promised from our last episode, this deck includes a brief takeaway from a sample project, which is a story generator. And so, personally, I've always been a huge fan of online fiction. I find it to be, I've always been a reader in general. Just ever since I was a kid, I read a lot. And as I aged, I found that the online fiction space and a lot of the online writing is a lot of fun because it's like way rougher and way less polished, but in exchange it's much more experimental, and people will spin up all sorts of ideas that sometimes they only half finish or quarter finish or just get the idea out. So it's a lot more of an open space, and it's enjoyable to see where all sorts of people's thought process goes without an editor and publisher ensuring it's polished and pressed for the masses. And so for this test, I outlined a small crafting novel concept. That's a niche I think is just generally underserved, mostly because doing a crafting novel, even somewhat well, requires more structure than a lot of the authors want to put into because they find it distracts from like their actual story. Although the ones that do this well tend to do quite well, and used it to drive an LLM based chapter builder. That was the core goal. I wanted to take an idea I had for a story and then be able to press a button and get a chapter on the other end of it. For our purposes, though, the real focus here isn't the story itself, but how the architecture handled sequential prompt chaining and file management. So basically, the architecture that ended up getting used, why it was used, and how that's going to implement or impact what we'll be doing for the presentation builder. And this is a quick outline of that architecture. So you can see there's a flow. It's a pretty like straight through diagram of one thing leading into the next thing sequentially. More complicated architectures get like absolutely bananas, but this is pretty simple because I just wanted to generate a chapter, but within bounds of the specific thing I was trying to do. The important thing here, though, you can see on the right hand side of the slide is the kinds of modules that got built. And I split those up into three things, which were pure Python code, LLM with context, and targeted LLMs. Now, the first pure Python code is basically file management, RNG, simulations, things of that nature, where the context builder, as an example, all of the files for the story, there was like something like 50 or 50,000 words or whatever. All of those were in my personal Obsidian, which is just like a file manager I have, and needed to be pulled into a space and cleaned up so they could actually be used by the LLMs intelligently. And then things like LLM with context were the parts responsible for the actual writing of the story in a cohesive, like, book reading manner. And finally, targeted LLMs were what they sound like, basically giving an LLM call, just like the previous example, but in this case with a really specific explanation and output expected of it. Usually something like generating a structured report or filling in a schema of some type in order to use it at some other piece of the pipeline. So the crafting plan, for instance, was a very tightly structured with rules. There were specific ways to use it and files that it could be pulling from. And it needed to be exactly like that because once you passed it to the Python code, those numbers were really important for actually generating it. So it trying to get, cute and creative would have basically broken the chain there. And the biggest takeaway I learned was, how to put this concisely, basically, if we go back over here in this context builder, I was pulling in all of the context for the story and entrusting the model to know what was important based on what part of the chapter it is from just like an explanation. But this is very much like not how that worked out. The chapter building components with this context tended to like get kind of wonky. So the writing would make sense. It would sequentially flow like a chapter. It wasn't like an insane ramblings or whatever. But it was just like very odd to read, very amateurish. It almost came across as a not particularly talented writer where English was not their first language. That's the way I would describe it. If you haven't read a lot of online fiction where people with English as a second language are, writing their first stories, like that might not make sense, but there was sort of this just flatness and odd dissonance. So like, it'd be writing about, one character walking in one of the test runs I did, and then like next thing you know, it's trying to explain the currency system, and I can see how it flowed and got there, but it just didn't make any sense in terms of the story. And so I just found that this excess background detail was diluting the story itself. Whereas in contrast, the targeted LLMs, the commission report, the crafting plan, things like that, those are working really well. And so they're more behind the scenes stuff, but the like reports, even some of the stuff you don't see in this general flow here, there's like, little boxes that were, checks, tests, and backups all kind of coming off little pieces of this pipeline. A lot of these were also in the targeted LLM space, but I didn't include them because they weren't a requirement to get to complete the chapter. And those were working really well. The more you structure exactly what it is for the LLM to do, like saying, oh, this is what a field will be. This is the like things you can actually put in and how you should decide. And here's like one example. That sequence gets you really consistent output if you can break it down to something sharp enough to do it in that manner. Which basically brings us to how to fix it, right? So if I have this story flow and I want to actually, go back into resolving this so it actually produces good chapters, how would I go about doing that? Well, there's like a couple of approaches you can take here. On one hand, you can just manually control the context going into it, just pick what you think you need each time and pass it through. But like that defeats the purpose of making it generated and automated. A secondary one would be to make a bunch of little flags, and so at each point, and make them across all of the documents and all of the context, and then at each point, basically split out the context builder so that it pulls from one or more of these flags based on exactly what you're doing. This would actually be a pretty solid approach if your goal was focused on just doing the story. So if I primarily care about just making a story, this is probably how I'd go about doing it. In my case, though, I'm more interested in building tools for other authors to produce works more quickly and cleanly that they're proud of. And for that, it's a lot of work and nitpicking to ask like a third party person who's less familiar with this to add a bunch of flags to stuff. And so the probably best way to handle it then would be RAG. And this is the professional standard these days. RAG stands for a retrieval augmented generation. And the way to understand RAG, in order to understand RAG, you need to know this about these LMs, these language models, or the large language models. What they do, fundamentally, is they allow you to convert text to numbers, like really well. And what that means when people talk about like semantic matching and all this stuff is that things that feel like they should operate close together in your head should show up in the math that an LM makes from this text in a way that tracks with your intuition. So let's say you have the term, water and wet, right? You'd expect these to be close because they feel close, or fire and hot, and you expect those to be close because they feel close. But water and fire should probably be more separated than water and wet or fire and hot. And that distance, those little measurements between like this point and this point, this point and this point, this point and this point, that is what a vector, vectorizing some language, allows you to do. It allows you to measure the distance, angles, orientations of these different things. And so the reason that's important is if you have a bunch of documents, like I do with the context builder, you can take them and you can vectorize them, where you can convert each of those documents. Usually it's only meaningful if they're small enough. You kind of have to play around with it. But you take each of those documents and you convert them into some string of numbers that some language model can use. And you store it in some database. And a database is just like a place where you can index a whole bunch of data. And then you write up your user query, or in this case, your prompt on what the chapter should be. And it takes the top K chunks. And what that means is it looks through all that documents. It says, oh, okay, like the user's query or this prompt for this chapter, it's like this long, like the numbers are in like this little segment of space. And the closest documents to matching that, like the things with the distance that are the smallest, right? It's ranked in this order. And top K just means you're taking, whichever ones you want from, your top 1 to the top 50 or whatever. It doesn't matter. And then you take those and you just tell the LLM, hey, this is useful context for this prompt. And then that goes into the prompt that you're doing along with whatever else you typed. And then the LLM will proceed to generate something. And this just generally is a really nice approach when you want to like fact check something or have something backing it and whatnot, and produces LLM results that are just like orders of magnitude more accurate and better generally. So if you do something like use Google's AI or something, and it's like, oh, AI mode, it's doing something like a RAG. Technically that's graph RAG because Google's just really good at a particular style of data management, so that's incorporated in there. But in general, that RAG pipeline allows you to have some building long sequence of information and reduce it down quickly into just what you need. So if I want to make like a generalized chapter assistant helper, this is the way you do it. Is you'd say, oh, hey, like in this folder, write all of the context from your story, and then write what this chapter will be about, and it'll sort through. And if it's doing it really well, we'll show you, be like, hey, are these like the things you think should be included? You say yes, and then you can use that. that's basically the one of the biggest takeaways. There's some other minor stuff, but it's less important for moving forward for the presentation builder specifically, where data management and making sure I keep the prompts general enough that I can swap in topics, but specific enough that the LLM knows exactly what it needs to build per slide and exactly what it's generating will be important here. And but for next week, we'll be focusing on slide generation more generally and the options to do that, because a lot of these AI tooling solutions are really, really bad at the intersection between like the text and visual. They usually just do one of those things pretty well, and slides generally tends to be a blurry mix of the two, which is one of the reasons there's not just a presentation builder up to my standards and I'm building my own already. It's because it's really hard to get this to do it consistently and properly. And we as well will need to make some trade-offs on exactly what we're asking the pipeline to do and how it's going to do that. So it'll probably end up, in general, the presentation builder will probably end up less visually layered than high-level consulting decks in exchange for being able to produce it iteratively and quickly. But there absolutely will be visuals, because I just can't abide the idea of a presentation builder. It doesn't have something to draw the eye. But yeah, so that'll be next week, is going over the options for that and an update on where we are at the coding so far and any early lessons learned there. But thank you all so much for coming and listening to this week's Ben's Almanac. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Goodbye.